And joining us now on the debate, John Manley, president of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. Stephen Clarkson, political economist at the University of Toronto and co-author of Dependent America. And we welcome back David Jacobson, United States Ambassador to Canada. It's good to have you two to join our ambassador here for this discussion. We played a clip of Barack Obama, and I guess in the interest of equal time, how about one from the Prime Minister? Michael, roll tape, please.
Today, we are pleased to announce ambitious agreements on perimeter security and economic competitiveness, as well as on regulatory cooperation. These agreements create a new, modern border for a new century. Together, they represent the most significant steps forward in Canada-U.S. cooperation since the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Mr. Manley, I want to know if the former Liberal Deputy Prime Minister of the country agrees with the current Conservative Canadian Prime Minister of the country that this is the most significant step forward in Canada-U.S. cooperation since NAFTA.
Well, I would have included the Smart Border Accord that I signed 10 years ago in that list.
I'll bet you would have.
But
yes.
I think it has the potential for being very, very important. I think it's also important to understand that what was announced in Washington is an action plan. So there's a lot of follow-through that has to occur for this to really make a significant difference.
Stephen Clarkson, what do you say?
Well, I'd say two things. One is I agree entirely with John Manley that the big game changer was not this week's agreement. It was his Smart Border Agreement, which introduced Canada into a completely new paradigm for North America, which was to turn us into a security state based on the U.S. obsession with terrorism.
I get the sense you're not saying that with a
well,
degree
I
of
think
complementarity.
that's what's happened. We are driven by the U.S. paranoia about terrorism compared to all the other problems that we have to face. So that was the big game changer. And I think what this agreement represents is, if we're using the game metaphor, it was a touchdown for the U.S. on the exit entry issue, which they had wanted and we had resisted. And I think the business community made some significant yards, and I'm sure Mr. Manley will tell us about the details. But for the rest, the Canadian government had to punt the ball back to the United States in all these working groups, and we intend to do this. We'll have a pilot project on that. After 10 years, they're still talking a language about we need to do things to improve the border.
Is that a fair,
and it's not a big change.
Fair observation, Ambassador, that this doesn't really, it punts the ball down the field on too many areas?
Absolutely not. That, first of all, with respect to who won and who lost, I think that loses sight of what trade is all about. That I think both sides won. That as we increase trade, it's good for both countries, it creates jobs in both countries, it's not a win or lose. The entry-exit thing is something that both countries have had complaints about, that they weren't doing it, and it's a way to solve it with a minimum of intrusion and a very low cost. But fundamentally, what this is about is both, on the one hand, creating a more secure North America, and on the other hand, more trade back and forth, better economies, more competition. And one last point, and on this one I think we all agree, this was a plan. This is an action plan, and it is only as good as the execution on the action plan.
Can I do a fast follow-up with you just on your kind of accusing America of being overly paranoid on security? They were attacked.
Yeah.
They did lose 3,000 people.
Sure.
On their soil, worst attack in their history on their soil. I mean, does that not give you pause?
Well, it was a great disaster, but the overreaction to it, the politicization of terrorism, by the Bush administration, Cheney and Bush and Rumsfeld, brilliantly exploited that disaster to turn the United States upside down and shift from economically developing country to one that was wanted to be a gated community and completely hived off from the rest of the world.
John Manley, do you see that?
Just to finish the point, it's had a very negative impact on our growth. North America's share of the global economy which had increased 5% in the 90s, has decreased 5% in the 2000s. So it's had a significant hit on our well-being.
Is America overly paranoid in your view?
Well, we weren't attacked, and so it's very hard for us sitting on our side of the border to be judgmental about it. I think that the point that Stephen makes is valid. I think that there are measures that are being taken in the name of security that do not enhance security, but that do interfere with the lives of ordinary Americans, and in some cases with the economy, and in other cases just with personal freedoms. And so to that degree, I believe there's been an overreaction, but I'm pretty pragmatic about it, as I was when I was in office. If that's what they're going to do, their democracy is going to deal with that. What I have to do in order to ensure that Canada continues to prosper to its greatest possible extent by virtue of our relationship with a close-by neighbor is see how we manage that border so that we don't, that we're inside rather than excluded from that economic zone, because our prosperity relies upon it.
Let me put a couple of things on the table here that question whether we're inside or outside or just not even on the radar at all. We asked, you all at this table know who the AFL-CIO is, the largest labor organization in the States. We asked for their response on this new agreement, and here's the email we got back. I don't think we have any comment, but thanks for thinking of us. The Washington Post spent more time on Wednesday reporting on the stalled Keystone XL pipeline business than they did on this agreement. So let's go around the table a bit on this. Should we be concerned, Ambassador, that this may be a very big deal for us up here, but like most things down in the States, we don't seem to have made much of a ripple at all on this?
Well, Steve, first of all, I think if you look at the press in some of the border jurisdictions in Detroit, in Buffalo, in Seattle, you're going to see a lot more comment. It's not surprising that some of the papers further down south that have less interface with Canada, that are less dependent on the back and forth between the United States and Canada, are going to not play it as big. I don't think this is a big deal at all. It's important to the president. It's important to my country. It's important to the creation of jobs. Canada's our largest trading partner, and that's why we did it.
What's your view on that?
Well, I think the major problem is setting up the Department of Homeland Security as a mega bureaucracy, which has driven security and wants to have total security against a possible terrorist entering the United States. And that has made it impossible for the American government to improve the border relationship. The Security and Prosperity Partnership was meant to do that in the 2000s. The Smart Border Agreement that John Manley negotiated with Mr. Ridge was meant to do that. But the resistance to actually, of DHS to making the changes that the business community has been pushing for is very impressive. And if you just take this agreement, it was set in motion 10 months ago to the week. Actually, 10 months and 3 days ago, they had the announcement, Mr. Obama and Mr. Harper, that they were going to develop this action plan. 10 months later, they have done a couple of things like the exit entry, but they're still talking about we intend to. The agreement is full of we intend to do this,
so
we intend to do that.
If that's the case, should Canadian business be bullish about this agreement?
Well, I think what Canadian business needs to do is be very diligent to push government to complete the promises that are contained in the action plan, and the AFL-CIO may be a good example. Actually, personally, I'm never concerned about us not having a high profile in the United States. Usually it's better for us to have a low profile. My old boss, Mr. Chrétien, was confronted by one of your colleagues one day with the fact that only 17% of Americans knew who he was, and his response was, "That's way too many." So, as long as we keep below the radar screen, we're probably doing okay. But our counterparts, and my counterpart, the Business Roundtable in the U.S., the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, these are organizations that are going to need to keep the pressure on the U.S. administration to say, this is important to us, we need the follow-through.
But when they don't pay attention to us, then nothing happens, and we're so invisible.
He says that's better.
Well, sometimes it does happen, and sometimes it doesn't happen when they do pay attention to us. That's the difficulty. I mean, I've had to intervene through editorial contributions in some of the elections last year where people were literally running against Canada. The governorship in Ohio was a case in point of that. We were trying to get the facts on the table. How many jobs in Ohio depend on trade with Canada? You're not losing jobs to Canada.
I think the fact is, and having participated in this process over the 10 months, there has been an enormous amount of effort at the highest levels of both governments to get to where we got. But I will agree with Stephen, I'll agree with John. This is a plan. And this plan is only going to be meaningful if we execute on the plan. And it's up to the Canadian people, it's up to the American people to insist that we do that.
It's a presidential election year, though. I mean, we got our funny business out of the way earlier this year, and we've got a government in place for the next 4. You guys are going to go through silly circus season like you cannot believe. What's the chance of anybody getting any business done under those circumstances?
I don't, first of all, as the President said the other day, I don't think this is a partisan issue. It is not a Republican issue or Democratic issue that we lower barriers to trade with our largest trading partner, that we enhance the security of North America, number one. And number two, we've had an awful lot of political issues over the last 10 months as we've been working our way through this. We've had debt ceilings and government shutdowns and wars and all kinds of things. And we've still been able to focus our attention. I really don't foresee that the fact that we're going through an election cycle is going to have any meaningful impact on the execution of this agreement, which we now have a plan for.
Do you think
surely there are no dollar signs in the agreement? The money is going to have to be voted or approved or allocated for bridges to be built or infrastructure to be improved or all these high-tech bomb sniffer technologies to be brought into place, and if the Canadian government can say, okay, we've decided we will do it, and Mr. Harper controls the government, but in the United States, how are you going to? This whole process has been excluded from from Congress. There's been no public participation in it, except for some consultations with business. How are you going to get Congress to approve the money?
Well, as the agreement makes very clear on both sides, the budgetary processes in both sides are going to have to work their way. I got to admit, our budgetary process has not functioned particularly effectively over the last few months. But Congress will pass budgets. Congress has passed budgets. They're still paying for things. And when we need money for things, we're going to presumably get it. And again, our budgets are several $1 trillion, and they do allocate the money. The issue is there are some very controversial things that we're fussing about, but I'm not sure that this is going to be controversial.
Mr. Manley, do you worry the American political calendar will derail this?
No, actually I don't, mainly because other than the appropriation issue, which we've been talking about, there's not really, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there's any of the actions that need to be approved by Congress. The funding does, but I think everything else is pretty much administrative responsibility.
It is executive action. It doesn't require legislation, or at least insofar as we can tell at this point, doesn't seem to require legislation.
Okay, here's John Ivison from the National Post from just a couple of days ago writing the following. The usual suspects are already lining up to pronounce all this will compromise our civil liberties. Yet, there is nothing here that should cause Canadian nationalists or civil libertarians sleepless nights. The Mayor Arar case still looms large, and there are legitimate concerns about individuals who've been cleared by the Canadian judicial system remaining on U.S. watch lists. But this agreement appears to do little to heighten existing concerns. Okay, Stephen Clarkson, your thought on that?
Well, when we integrate our data in the U.S. data banks, it raises real questions about the citizens' right to know what has been recorded about them. I know that just in our own country, the RCMP has got stuff in its files on me which are completely wrong. How does the Canadian, well, you know, when I was a younger academic, my political leanings or stuff, and how are Canadians going to get access to American data banks to protest, let's say, why they weren't allowed onto an Air Canada flight from Vancouver, which happened to a former minister of the Liberal government of Mr. Creighton, Bill Graham. He was actually denied entry onto a Canadian plane going traveling within the country. How does a citizen get to have some confidence that his or her information, having gone into the integrated intelligence and police system, is going to be accessible and correctable if it's false? Just as one example, that's a huge issue.
I should ask the ambassador just to comment on that, plus the fact that our National Privacy Commissioner, Jennifer Stoddard, said, quote, "We are ever closer to the bleak reality of a surveillance society if we continue to collect and share more personal data with the United States."
Well, I think it's predicated on a misunderstanding of what we're doing. We're not integrating our computer systems. We're not sharing information willingly. It's just not part of the deal. And when we put this thing together, we were very cognizant of the belief in privacy and sovereignty on both sides of the border. I mean, I think one of the things, Steve, that's very important for your viewers to understand is that the people of the United States value privacy every bit as much as Canadians do. We sometimes protect it in a little bit different ways, but we value it every bit as much. And we constructed this thing in a way so that we would protect it.
Anything here to be concerned about, Mr. Manley?
No, I don't think so. I think that there's nothing in the agreement that would give me any additional concern. It's also important, I think, to note that we're all around this panel of more or less of a certain age. There's a generation that takes a totally different outlook on privacy issues
the Facebook
than we
generation.
do, and the Facebook
They got it all
generation
out
is
there.
exactly that.
Yeah.
So, you know, I certainly wouldn't worry about anything that's in this agreement being in any way a compromise of personal information. And, you know, I mean, Jennifer Stoddard does an excellent job. That's a piece of legislation that I actually was responsible for as Minister of Industry. And it's based on a very fundamental concept, which is informed consent. And I think it is important that when citizens understand, that they understand, you know, what information is shared and where it's accessed from, and consent to it. But that's I don't think in any way compromised by what is being done here.
But the whole the document is full of references to sharing information, despite what the ambassador said. The whole risk assessment, all the decisions about who constitutes a risk has to be based on information.
But those are
and
not
that's
our
shared.
citizens. Those are people that want to come to North America. And I always have, you know, I have this discussion with Tom Ridge. How crazy is this? We say no to somebody entering Canada who comes to the embassy in Rome, and they get on a train and they go to the U.S. embassy in, say, Amsterdam or Paris, and they apply for entry to the United States. We don't even tell one another that we had reasons to refuse to permit that person to enter. I think that's sort of basic stuff in today's time.
Does that sound
Sure.
reasonable?
Well, yeah, but sure, for foreigners trying to, or dangerous foreigners trying to get into North America. But what about there's a clause about investigating possible terrorists or radicals, the process of radicalization that may be going on in the two countries. Who defines what a radical is? How is that investigation going to take place? Some of our RCMP people are very, very dumb in what they think is a dangerous person, just because he or she has a different point of view.
Actually, what that section was about was sharing our best practices about how we combat the process of radicalization of youth. And that there are things, and this is a process that's already ongoing, but there are things that Canadians have done extremely effectively that Americans can learn from, and there are things we've done that you can learn from. This isn't a matter of targeting people in each other's country or anything of the sort. It's working together so that we try to minimize radicalization. And you know, it sounds to me like that one's kind of common sense.
More feedback from the Toronto Daily Star, one of this country's finer newspapers. Here's Thomas Walcom writing yesterday. It's hard to blame the U.S. for the one-sided nature of this deal. Under both the Liberals and the Conservatives, Canada's federal government has been a most willing patsy. It was a Liberal government that ordered its security services to pass on every unsubstantiated rumor to the U.S., a practice that resulted in the arrest, jailing, and torture of Canadian citizen Maher Arar. It was a Liberal government that, after 9/11, allowed America's Federal Bureau of Investigation to vastly expand its operations in Canada. By 2006, agents from the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives were also operating here. On Wednesday, Harper lauded the new border deal as the most important Canada-U.S. pact since the North American Free Trade Agreement. He was right, but not because this deal will do much for trade. Okay, John Manley, you always got along with the Toronto Star. What do you make of this?
Flat out untrue.
Which
in
part
fact,
of it?
we had a whole inquiry into the Arar case. There's absolutely no substance in the suggestion that the government told the RCMP to pass on information. That's just flat out wrong. What I think he's trying to refer to there is what we've had for a long time called Integrated Border Enforcement Teams, or IBETs. It's an attempt to recognize the fact that the border can't act as some kind of barrier to criminal activity. so that we need to cooperate. Otherwise, you remember those old westerns where they rode as fast as they could to get across the border in order to wave goodbye to the sheriff that was chasing them. Now we collaborate, whether it's on enforcement of laws with respect to alcohol, tobacco, or drugs, in order to make sure that the border doesn't become some kind of shield against law enforcement. I think that's just plain good sense.
Stephen Clarkson, what do you think of Welcome's point here?
Well, which point? Because he covered a lot of ground.
He did cover a lot of ground. How about the part about Mayor Arar?
Well, that's the issue I've raised myself. If there's been false allegations, if allegations have been made which are actually based on misinformation, and that information's in these data banks, how does the citizen get it corrected? And as far as I understand, the ambassador can correct me, the United States has still not taken Arar off its danger list or its suspect list.
Is that right? Is he still on a no-fly list?
How do we work?
We don't comment on. And I'm not going to talk specifically about Arar, but I think to John's point, what we're trying to do is to expand on one thing that has been extraordinarily successful. It's something called Shiprider. Americans and Canadians work together on water, on our water borders. It saves money, it's more effective, and as John says, it keeps bad guys from using the border defensively. And what we want to do through something we're calling Next Gen is to apply that same concept, and it's not any old policeman in Canada can go into the United States or vice versa, but specially trained, specially badged teams who work together, and when they're in the United States, U.S. law applies, and when they're in Canada, Canadian law applies.
Professor Clarkson, is it your position that our negotiators just aren't that good?
Well, that's what my new book gets into. It's that compared to how powerful an impact Canada and Mexico have on the United States in terms of building its economy. We reckon that 3% of U.S. GNP is thanks to the relationship the U.S. has with Canada and Mexico. $1,000 per average American can be traced to that very, very strong economic relationship. Compared to that, when Ottawa negotiates with Washington, it's amazingly limp. It's not that we're scared of kicking Mexico in the shins with imposing visas, or we're not scared actually of blocking Mr. Obama at the last G8 meeting in his two-state approach to Palestine and Israel. But when we negotiate with Washington, we cave in. We accept their demand, and we get peanuts in return. And that's the softwood lumber. It's the Buy American negotiations. And this is fits in the
other side of the table
example.
wants to comment on this. Go ahead.
Well, you know, I don't agree, and I think that what we have in this case is not that at all. In fact, there are mutual benefits. And Canada benefits tremendously from that trade. If Canada and Mexico only contribute 3% of the U.S. GDP to the U.S. economy, what does the U.S. contribute to the Canadian economy when it's 75% of our trade is going there? This is pretty meaningful. And you know, I was never the biggest guy in the schoolyard. And I used to always think that I had to use my brains rather than my brawn in order to survive. Well, we're dealing with the United States. Sometimes we have to be, we can't pound the table. Sometimes we have to use our arguments and our intelligence in order to try to make things work. I went through the agreement with Tom Ridge. We got things in there that they just didn't want to give us. And the best example of that was the Safe Third Agreement, which relieved a lot of the pressure that we were facing on refugee claimants coming into Canada from Buffalo in particular. The U.S. Department of Justice said no. And Tom Ridge went and said, they've given us this, we're giving them that. And at the end of the day, we signed the agreement. I don't think that
this does speak to an issue, though.
I just want to say the one thing in response to the professor's comment. I was there in many of these negotiations, and if there's one thing I can assure you, it is that the Canadians did not go limp in these discussions. We approached these things as partners. We approached these things as equals in these discussions, and I think we came away with an agreement that was, as John says, it was beneficial to both sides. This isn't somebody won and somebody lost and we're giving up this and they're getting that. but rather that we're going to try to construct this thing in a way so that we all win.
He does speak for a good chunk of the Canadian public, though, who almost always think that if we're sitting down at the same table as the United States of America, we're somehow going to get screwed because they're 10 times bigger than us. What do you say to those folks?
We are 10 times bigger than you. All I can tell you is, having participated now over the last couple of years in an awful lot of discussions with the Canadians, I have yet to come away from one thinking, boy, we really put one over on those guys.
But of course, they would expect you to say that. So I'm not sure that,
well, perhaps, but it has the added virtue of being true.
Okay. Stephen Clarkson, let me try this. Alan Gottlieb, former Canadian ambassador to the United States, once said that satisfying American security concerns open doors in Washington like no other key. Is it a bad thing if we give them some satisfaction on security, which they desperately want and perhaps understandably want after 9/11, if we get stuff that we want in return? What's the problem with that?
Well, we've been giving them stuff on security. John Manley negotiated with Tom Ridge an agreement 10 years ago, and it did not open the border. I think Art Eggleton, when he was Minister of Defense, talking about sending troops to Afghanistan, said that's going to give us benefit on the softwood lumber case. I don't think there's that kind of trade-off. The system doesn't work that way. If we give them what they want on security, it's because that's what they demand. They don't offer any other benefits. So I don't think they have a linkage in their system. They are obsessed with this kind of security. There are many other kinds of security that they might be they might appropriately be more concerned about, namely narcotics security. And we haven't mentioned this, but this whole agreement, when you raise narcotics, excludes Mexico. So we're creating a new, or the old North America, which is Canada, United States, and leaving out Mexico because it's so difficult to deal with. But I'd say that the major security concerns in North America have to do with drug violence, with the cartels who are increasingly powerful in in Mexico, and who are connected to us through the integrated drug trade.
We're actually going to do a program on this next Wednesday. Stay tuned on that. We got 10 minutes to go here, and I want to play another clip here of not President Obama and Prime Minister Harper, but rather of two guys who call each other Stephen and Barack. Roll tape, please.
Stephen, I believe this is the 11th time that we've sat down and worked together. Unfortunately, I only speak one language. Stephen moves effortlessly between two. In Stephen, I've got a trusted partner. And Stephen, on this day and in all the discussions that we have, I want to thank you again for your candor. And so, Stephen, to all the people of Canada, thank you.
Well, thank you, Barack. And of course, I do want to thank you for your friendship. Not just personally, Barack, but I know the friendship you feel for the entire nation of Canada, and we all do appreciate it.
What's with that?
They like each other. I think they respect each other. They respect each other's views. They don't just respect each other's views publicly, they respect each other's views privately. I have seen it in private moments. Each of them has told me about the other.
Can you give me, for instance, there?
Well, when we were in the Oval Office the other day, and the way that they were sharing views and soliciting each other's views about what to do about some of the trouble spots in the world. On more than one occasion, the President said, look, this is what we're doing, but you guys may have better ideas. What do you think? And that's an unusual relationship. There is an extraordinary relationship between the United States and Canada and between the American people. And I think the personal relationship between the President and the Prime Minister mirrors that.
I'm not sure, though, that Jean Chrétien would have thought it was a great idea to be seen to be that personally close with the American President. I know he loved to show off the fact that even though he was 15 or more years older than Bill Clinton, he could jump walls better than Bill Clinton could. But I'm not sure that he wanted to be on that first name of basis with him. Is that fair to say?
I don't actually think so, Steve. I think they had a very similar kind of relationship. It was a little more strained when it was President Bush in the White House, although it was cordial. It was better than many people think it was. But with Bill Clinton, it was rather like that they would talk before international meeting and strategize about how they would manage the meeting.
But that's privately. This is in public. This is very chummy in public.
Oh, they had press conferences together, and they played golf together, and Bill Clinton did us an enormous service when, because his friend asked him, he spoke at a federalism conference in Quebec not long after the referendum in 1995. In fact, he was helpful to us during the referendum in 1995, which was as close as we've come to seeing this country go to pieces. So, I think that they had that personal chemistry. I think that, Prime Minister Trudeau's, one of his pallbearers was Jimmy Carter. Brian Mulroney built a very close relationship with both President Reagan and President Bush Sr. This goes back a long way in our history.
Should we be pleased, Professor Clarkson, about the fact that the American president apparently values the advice of the Canadian Prime Minister so much?
Well, he may or he may not. I can't speak to that. But if your main question is about the first-name basis of that exchange, I found it embarrassing watching that, and undignified, and a bit condescending.
Why?
Well, these are heads of state. These are two, for us, very important people. And to be this kind of casual strikes me as inappropriate.
They're trying to show the world, obviously, that they're close and get along.
Well, if they're that close and get along so well, why has it taken 3 months to get 30 minutes of FaceTime for the Canadian Prime Minister with the American President? This agreement was more or less wrapped up in August. We were told to expect it any day now. And it took all this time. Why? Because we are so unimportant in Washington.
Is this first-name basis business meant to mask the fact that the Prime Minister can't get on the President's docket?
First of all, the predicate of that is wrong, but no, absolutely not. They like each other. The fact is they like each other. I think you saw it there. And as I say, I've seen it in private, and I think that's a really good thing.
But and how far does the like extend when Mr. Harper is so retrograde on global environmental issues? When he blocked Mr. Obama's position at the G8 on the Palestine-Israel issue, is that discrepancy not an issue with them?
You know what? They represent people in two sovereign nations, and we don't always agree on everything, nor probably should we always agree on everything. But the fact that they like each other, the fact that they can have not just cordial but frank exchanges, the fact that they can respect each other's points of view, I think is a positive. It's a positive between nations. It's a positive between people within a government. It's just it's positive between people, period.
So what does the President say when the Prime Minister calls him up and says, we really need Keystone, and you guys just put it on the back burner for a year? That's not going to help either one of our economies.
I was there when he said that. And the President indicated that this was a serious issue. There was a serious problem that was raised in Nebraska, that he wanted to get it right, that we've said from the beginning that we are going to get it right, and that we're going to gather the facts, and then he's going to make a decision. And it's an example of we don't always have to agree, and we can still be both cordial and respectful and understanding of each other's points of view. I wouldn't expect Canada and the United States to agree on everything. There'd be something wrong. I mean, I don't agree with myself some of the time.
That whole Keystone issue, that's just politics, right? That's election year politics?
Well, it's a complicated bit
Yeah,
of
but
politics,
at the end of the day,
you had a kind of a NIMBY reaction, if I may say so, in Nevada, allied with a very forceful environmental lobby that is intent on keeping hydrocarbons under the earth, and that was a pretty potent combination. We've issues sometimes in Canada that get a little bit complicated because of the politics.
But after the elections, after the U.S. election's over, you think Keystone's going through?
Well, I believe that what we will see is a somewhat different route that will deal with some of the local concerns in Nevada, and I think that's already in train.
How about, can I ask you that too? Once the election's over, is Keystone a done deal?
You know, the President's going to, this is exactly what he said the other day. He's going to make the decision, and hopefully he's still the President when it's time to make that decision.
Okay. We got, how am I doing here? About 3 minutes left? 2 minutes left. 2 minutes left. Let me read something. I quoted Brian Mulroney earlier, so let's do that again. Here's Canada's 18th Prime Minister writing in Policy Options back in March. The most important file on my desk and on the desk of any Prime Minister of Canada is the Canada-U.S. relationship. Professor Clarkson, is he right about that?
It is. We are integrated in the United States economy.
You wish it were that way?
Well, that's the fact. So the Canadian government has to be responsible for the well-being of Canadians. It's got to take the United States seriously. How it does that is another question. And my own feeling is we do it far too fearfully, far too unconscious of how important we are to them. Of course, what John Manley said a little earlier, they are very important to us. And we also do it increasingly, particularly under Mr. Harper now, in isolation from Mexico.
Okay,
which I think is a huge mistake.
I'm going to hold you short because I want to make sure everybody gets in on this. With the economic difficulties, with the political silly season, with all of this, more Canadians are saying we got to find a different partner besides the U.S. to do business with. In spite of what Mr. Mulrooney said, is that wise?
I don't think that people are saying we need to find a different partner. I don't think people are saying let's abandon the United States and look to Asia or anything like that. What they're talking about is saying that we need to look for other opportunities, other trading opportunities in addition to the United States. That's good for Canada, and quite frankly, it's good for the United States.
You want the last 20?
I agree it's diversification, but let me say I disagree with Brian Mulrooney on that. Since John A. Macdonald, the #1 file for every Canadian Prime Minister has been the unity of the country.
You know what? I asked him. I remember when he said about this, and he said, well, that goes without saying. He says, job one, of course.
I just said it.
Job one, of course, keep the country together.
Right.
But in terms of other files, but yes.
Those two are things that the Prime Minister has to be personally engaged on. Almost everything else, he has competent ministers to look after.
I want to thank all three of you for coming in and having such a vigorous and civilized debate. David Jacobson, United States Ambassador to Canada, thank you very much. John Manley, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Canadian Council of Chief Executives, and Stephen Clarkson from the University of Toronto, Dependent America, his latest book. Thanks so much, everybody.